some weeks ago, actually maybe months, I did some videos on the Nano VNA, a vector network analyzer that you see here. It's a very nice little unit. It's very cheap. I think I paid less than $50 for mine. You can order them from lots of places, and I'm not going to re-review the Nano VNA. But recently I noticed that there are a whole bunch of new vector network analyzers based on this same architecture, but that have a lot of different characteristics that are in many ways better than this original Nano VNA. Now I'm going to turn this off for a second because I want you to see the display when it starts up. Notice it says Nano VNA-H. I realize that was pretty quick, but that was the original Nano VNA. Let me turn on some more light here, and this is the Nano VNA-H and its basic specifications. It went from 50 kilohertz to 900 megahertz. Well, I recently noticed two new ones, and actually there's a yet newer one than this that's hard to get. One is called the Nano VNA H4. Remember, the original is the H. And another one called the Nano VNA F. Now, I don't have the Nano VNA F. I'm just quoting here from the Newegg website what they say the specifications are. Now, I've seen differing. The reason I'm referring to Newegg is that shows you where you can get these figures. But I have also seen this one advertised as having different frequency range than this is shown here. So since I don't own it, I can't verify whether Newegg's website is correct. But if that's to be believed, the F is basically the H, except it now goes down to 10 kilohertz and goes all the way up to 1 gigahertz, which is slightly higher than the 900 megahertz. Also, it appears that the dynamic range of the F is improved, but take that with a grain of salt. Like I say, I haven't been able to test that one. But I have been able to test the VNA H4 because I bought one through Amazon. And I'll show you that in a little bit. Here are some of the other differences. The H4 goes up to 1.5 gigahertz. So in other words, instead of 900 megahertz. Also, the 60 dB dynamic range, instead of going up only to 600 megahertz, goes up to 900 megahertz. And then the 40 dB dynamic range, of course, the top of the H is 900, so that's the absolute max. But according to the specs, now I haven't actually checked this all the way to 1500, but I have verified that mine, for example, gets 43 dB of dynamic range at a gigahertz. So I can verify that at least for most of this range, it works pretty well. The screens are a little different. The original screen was this little 2.8 inch that you see here. The new one has a 4-inch screen, and we'll see that when we fire up the H4. The batteries are different as well. The old battery was 650 milliamp hour. The new one is 1950. Now, the F, at least from its specs, appears to have an even larger screen size, tiny amount larger, but still a little bit larger, and a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, so much longer battery life. The case is important because in the VNA-H, there is no case, so that means that RF from the unit is leaking out as well as leaking in, because there is no shielding around the outside. Now, it is on a printed circuit board that has a ground plane, so it's not completely open to interference, but it both radiates and receives interference. The VNA H4 has a metal case. It's an aluminum case. Finally, the charging is different. The charging rate on the VNA-H is only 120 milliamps. The charging on the H4 is 200. Now, the specs say that the VNA-F can charge at 1 amp rate. Now, of course, you have to be careful. Some USB sockets and chargers won't provide a full amp of charging, but apparently it's capable of taking that. And given the higher milliamp hour capacity, that would be useful to have that additional charging ability to cut down the charging time. So that is a basic comparison. Before we take a look at the actual unit, let me show you the specs of a yet newer unit. And pardon that I'm fumbling here with papers that I should have probably had out already. Here we are. There is a unit called a V2, a version 2 of the Nano VNA. It claims to go out to 3 gigahertz. Now, I don't have one of these, and right now it takes, at least from what I've seen, it takes 3 to 4 months to get them from China, and that's the only place that I could find them available. But the dynamic range, as you notice, it claims 60 dB of dynamic range all the way up to 3 gigahertz. So if that's true, this is a superior unit even to the VNA H4. I won't go through all of the rest of this because it's basically, much of this is the same. But, for example, it does have a 1,000 points of sweep points. Now, I believe that these others, including the H4, I haven't checked the number of points, but I think they only do 100 points. And that's important when you're doing a wide frequency sweep, because it really means that your stepping points are spaced quite a ways apart. Well, enough. Once again, these are just based on the specs I was able to find online. I do not have one of these. So let's take a look at the one I do have, or the two I do have, and do some comparisons. Here is a comparison between the Nano VNA H4 and the original Nano VNA. This, I think, is sometimes called the Nano VNA H. At least on the internet now, that's what they call it. And also, if I remember right, when you power this one up, I think that, yeah, it says Nano VNA H at the top. This one says Nano VNA H4. So the only difference is the 4 at the end of this one. Notice the difference in the screens. I'm going to turn off some light here so you can see them maybe a little better. Obviously, the difference is in the screen size. There are a few other differences. For example, I'm told that this one, I saw online where this one apparently has a little more shielding than this one does, and we may look at that a little bit later. I have this one connected to a new item, this board that I also bought, that I probably will do a little mini review on this board because it's a very nice addition. I got this as a package when I ordered the H4. The board came along for, I don't remember, $10 or $12 more. Online, these boards sell for about $25, so it was a nice plus to be able to get it. But like I say, I'll review that separately, not here, although I will use it for a few experiments to show you. I'm not going to actually show a comparison function by function or anything like that. Mainly what I'm going to do is I'm going to see where this unit does things that the original VNA, Nano VNA, doesn't do. For example, I know that this one goes to 1.5 gigahertz. Supposedly this only goes to 900, although we're gonna push it and using the VNA Saver software and see if we can get it to go above 900. But because I understand that some of the firmware for this will push it to 900, though the specs aren't guaranteed. Also, one last thing, I did order a V2. That's the newest Nano VNA, and but as usual, it comes from China, and I ordered it through Newegg, so I'll keep you apprised of that. But that could be days, weeks, maybe even months before we see that. Okay, this is the Nano VNA Saver software that you can download on the internet. It's up and running. This is on a Windows 7 machine, but I've seen videos that people have been able to get it to work on Windows 10, and I'm sure it works on others. But at any rate, we're going to go down here in the corner. You see where the mouse is, and connect to the Nano VNA. And I have right now, by the way, I have a 10 dB attenuator connected to it, and it is running from 50 kilohertz to 900 megahertz. Now I'm going to change this to 1500 megahertz and do a sweep. And you see there's a fall off at the very end out there. So one of the first things that you need to do is to calibrate, and you calibrate by coming down here in the lower left hand corner and click on calibration, and then you see it will say that it needs to calibrate for a short, an open, a load, isolation, and through. And this you can do this manually, but if you click on Calibration Assistant down here, it'll guide you through the steps and tell you what to do at each step. For example, it says here that how to do it if you just want a 1-port calibration, or what to do if you want a 2-port calibration. So it says once you're ready to proceed, press OK. So you click OK, and then it says connect the short standard to port 0. Now what I'm going to do is go through the calibration, but I'm not going to do it on video because you've seen that in one of my previous videos, and there must be 50 videos online that show you how to do that. So I'm going to pause the video right now while I go through the calibration from 50 kilohertz to 1500 megahertz. Okay, we're back having completed the calibration. Now I will tell you I've used the demo board that I showed you earlier that I haven't reviewed yet, so just take my word for it that that's what I'm using. Later, when I do a review of that, I'll show you, I'll go through the calibration procedure on that board, because you do have to calibrate for that board, particularly if you're going to use anything above about 500 megahertz. Okay, so now we've calibrated it, and we have already applied it, and I have saved it. Down here you have a save calibration and a load calibration. So we have saved it, and this is the sweep of the through calibration. Now what we're going to do is one more sweep, and you notice that at the very end over on the left, let me turn the camera a little bit that way. There we go. You notice that there's a little droop at the high end. Now it's only about, it looks like about a 1.5 to 2 dB droop, but still it is down at the high end. What I'm now going to do is switch over to that 10 dB attenuator that I was using earlier. Now let me pause it. Okay, now we're ready to do a sweep on a 10 dB attenuator. And you see there's a little bit of a rise at the far right over here at about 1200 megacycles, and then a little bit of a dip, but the dip is no worse than it was using the through connector of this same board. So pretty flat out to 1500 megahertz. There, by the way, is something online. There is some confusion about whether it will go down to 10 kilohertz or not. I've tried going down there. It really just doesn't work very well, at least mine doesn't. Neither of mine work below 50 kilohertz reliably, so I wouldn't count on anything below 50 kilohertz. So that is a 10 dB attenuator. Now let's hook up an LC circuit and see what that looks like. Okay, this is what the LC circuit looks like, and you may notice that it is a sequence of peaks and valleys that sort of grow over time in terms of the, this is, at the top is the return loss, by the way. So the return loss gets worse, or the SWR gets worse, I guess I should say. In other words, it's not as good a match. Then down at the bottom is the phase for S21. I'm going to change that to show a Smith chart. To change to a Smith chart, we click on Display Setup here. And then you may notice this is S21 gain and S21 phase. We want to change this to S11 return loss, and this one to S11 Smith chart. Okay? Now we're going to run it again. And there you see, this is an LC circuit, and you notice that the return loss is pretty constant, but look at the Smith chart. It makes a complete circle, and the reason for that is that we're on the end of a transmission line, and over the full frequency range, this is what the impedance looks like. Now, of course, it starts out with an open because there's a capacitor in series with this. As the frequency increases, you notice that it goes around, eventually becoming inductive, where the capacitor stops being the dominant factor in the circuit and comes on around, and then gets rather, not as regular, let's say, over in this part, which it corresponds to this part of the return loss. So that is the S21 chart. Now, by the way, I'm going to try something here I haven't tried before. I'm going to click on the apparently you can set the frequency axis to logarithmic, and let me rerun the sweep. Okay, and there you see this is now a logarithmic plot. So this is only 150 megahertz, but let me turn off some light. I'm getting a glare. There we are. Yeah, actually that's 190 megahertz. But I'm going to go back to the linear frequency. I need to play more with this VNA saver because it definitely has a lot of features that I haven't learned to use yet. But we've now seen that we can go up to 1500 megahertz with this unit. Now what we're going to do is switch over and put the original Nano VNA on and run this same experiment again. Okay, we've now connected the original Nano VNA, or I will call it the H rather than the H4. And now let's look at the saver software on this one. Okay, here is a run, and here we're only going to 900 megahertz. And we're going to do a sweep, and once again this is that LC circuit. And notice pretty much the same thing, and the response is pretty much the same out to 900 megahertz. It's a little more, it's a little noisier in this area than it was with the H4, but not that much that it makes a big difference. Notice that, once again, relatively flat out here to about just under 900 megahertz, where it starts to fall off a bit. Now what we're going to do, though, is I'm going to try changing this to 1,000 kilohertz. I'm sorry, 1,000 megahertz. Okay, now you notice that it went out to 1,000. So let's go out a little further. Let's see if we go to 1,200 megahertz. Well, there you see it did some really strange things. I would say that it's better based on mine. Now your unit may perform differently depending on what firmware you have loaded on it, and you can change the firmware, but I am going to stick to the original 900 megahertz because I think I get, I get reasonably reliable results. So, except for the difference in the display size, and of course the better battery capacity and some other things, I would say that the H4 and the VNA-H are essentially the same unit up to 900 megahertz. And so if you're looking for a nice vector network analyzer, there's no reason to pay the additional. Now, I only paid, I think, $75 for mine, including that little board that I told you about, which added, I think, was added $10 to the price. I think it was $64.95 without the board and $74.95 with the board. I don't remember the exact numbers because I bought it actually some weeks ago, but it's in that price range. Now the Nano VNA, the original one, is now down below $50. I've seen places selling it for $43.95. So you are talking about a probably $25 difference. But if it were me, I'd go ahead and get the H4 because it has the bigger display, it has the wider frequency response, the bigger battery. And once again, your results may vary. This is just my opinion, but I think the H4 is worth the $65 over the original at, say, $45. So I hope this has given you a little bit of an idea of what's available out there. As soon as I get my V2, I'll review it and I'll come back and compare it to these two. But for right now, I think this is enough, and we'll move on to maybe some other subjects. So please stay tuned and have a nice day.